The mysterious disappearance. Ethan was a simple man who lived on the edge of a quiet countryside. He had built a peaceful life for himself away from the noise of the city. His small wooden house stood near a dense forest that stretched for miles, and every evening he took his loyal dog Rusty for a walk along the forest path. Rusty was more than a pet to him. He was family. The two of them had shared years of quiet companionship, watching sunsets, chasing rabbits, and exploring the woods together. That evening, the sky was painted with shades of orange and purple, the cool air carried the smell of wet leaves, and the forest was unusually still. Usually, birds filled the air with chirps and rustles, but now there was only silence. Ethan felt a strange weight in the air, like something was watching from between the trees. Rusty walked ahead happily, wagging his tail, unaware of the strange tension that surrounded them. As they reached a narrow path deeper into the forest, Rusty suddenly stopped, his ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan followed his gaze and saw nothing but darkness between the trees. He called Rusty softly, but the dog didn't move. Then, without warning, Rusty barked loudly and sprinted into the darkness. His bark echoed through the trees as his body disappeared into the shadows. "Rusty!" Ethan shouted, panic rising in his voice. He ran after him, pushing through branches and stumbling over roots. The forest seemed endless, and the light from his flashlight barely cut through the dark. The barking grew fainter with every second, until it vanished completely. All Ethan could hear now was his own breathing and the crunch of dry leaves under his boots. He reached a small clearing where the trees parted, and a faint blue light flickered deep between the trunks. It wasn't like any flashlight or lantern he had ever seen. The light pulsed slowly like it was alive. Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He whispered Rusty's name again, but only silence answered. He stepped toward the glow, but as he got closer, the light blinked out, leaving nothing but darkness. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. Ethan searched for hours, calling Rusty's name again and again. His voice grew hoarse and his legs ached. He checked every corner, every hollow tree, and every bush, but there was no sign of his loyal friend. The forest remained silent, watching him, like it held a secret it refused to share. His flashlight began to dim as the battery ran low, and the shadows grew thicker around him. Eventually, exhausted and heartbroken, Ethan made his way back home. Rusty's empty leash hung from his hand, swinging with every step. The night sky above him was covered with heavy clouds. Hiding the stars, a cold wind blew through the fields, carrying the faint scent of pine and something else he couldn't place, something sharp and metallic. He turned once to look back at the forest, and for a brief second, he thought he saw two small glowing dots watching him from the darkness. They disappeared the moment he blinked. Inside his house, everything felt different. The warmth of the small fireplace could not ease the heavy feeling in his chest. Rusty's bed was empty, his food bowl untouched. The silence of the house felt louder than ever. He sat down on his old wooden chair, staring at the door as if expecting Rusty to burst in at any moment. But the night passed slowly, with only the wind howling outside. As he finally closed his eyes, sleep didn't bring peace. Instead, strange dreams filled his mind. He dreamed of the forest glowing faintly under a strange blue sky, and two small silhouettes standing beside Rusty. Their eyes glowed bright like stars, watching him from a distance. He woke up with a start, his heart racing. Sweat covered his forehead, and the room felt colder than before. He tried to shake off the dream, telling himself it was just his worried mind playing tricks on him, but deep down, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something extraordinary had happened in the woods that night. Something beyond his understanding. The disappearance of Rusty was not just a simple case of a dog running away. It felt like the beginning of something far bigger, something that would change everything he thought he knew. Ethan sat by the window as the first light of dawn touched the sky. He looked toward the forest, determined to search again. This time, he would not stop until he found out what had taken his loyal friend. He didn't know it yet, but the answer waiting for him inside those dark woods would not only bring him back to Rusty, it would introduce him to something he had never imagined. Two alien children who would change his destiny forever. Signs in the morning. The first light of the morning broke through the misty fields as Ethan stepped outside with tired eyes and a restless heart. The night had been long and heavy, filled with strange dreams and an uneasy silence that never truly let him rest. The forest stood ahead of him, silent and dark beneath a pale sky, as if holding its breath. He slung his worn backpack over his shoulder, slipped Rusty's empty leash into his pocket, and headed toward the trees with a determined look. He refused to believe that Rusty had simply vanished. Something had happened in those woods, and he was going to find out what it was. The path was covered with a thin layer of morning dew, and the grass sparkled faintly under the rising sun. As Ethan moved deeper into the forest, he noticed how the usual sounds of birds and small animals were still missing. Normally, mornings in the woods were alive with noise, but now everything felt muted. As if nature itself was uneasy, the air was thick and cool, carrying the faint scent of something metallic, something unnatural. His boots made soft, crunching sounds as he followed the trail they had taken last night, and with every step his heart beat a little faster. Soon he reached the point where Rusty had run off. He examined the ground carefully and noticed something strange near the path. There were footprints, but not just any footprints. They were long and narrow, pressed deep into the damp earth, and they didn't match any animal he knew. They almost looked like human footprints, but with extra joints, like something that had too many toes. Beside them were faint paw prints that belonged to Rusty. Ethan followed them slowly, noticing how the ground seemed disturbed in a perfect circle nearby. The grass was bent outward as if pushed by an invisible force, and at the center of the circle the soil looked scorched, leaving behind blackened earth and tiny sparkling fragments that glowed faintly even in daylight. Ethan crouched down to touch one of the glowing fragments, but as soon as his fingers brushed it, the light faded. Leaving behind nothing but cold dust, his heart skipped a beat. He had lived near these woods his whole life and had never seen anything like this. No human machine could have left such precise burn patterns or glowing residues. He looked around carefully, realizing that there were faint markings on the trees too. Thin, almost laser-like lines carved in perfect curves. They reminded him of symbols, though he couldn't understand their meaning. It was as if something intelligent had been here, something that didn't belong to this world. He moved deeper along the faint trail. Following Rusty's paw prints, they led him to a narrow creek, where the morning mist hovered above the water like a soft blanket. There, lying on a flat rock, was Rusty's collar. The metal tag shimmered in the soft light, but the leather was completely intact. No claw marks, no tears, no blood. It was as if someone had carefully removed it and placed it there. Ethan picked it up slowly, his hands trembling slightly, and whispered his dog's name under his breath. The silence answered him again, heavier now, almost pressing against his ears as he stood there by the creek. Something caught his eye in the water. At first it looked like a reflection, but when he knelt closer, he saw faint glowing lines running beneath the surface. Like veins of light embedded in the creek bed, they pulsed slowly, the same way the strange blue light had pulsed in the forest the night before. He dipped a stick into the water to touch the glow, but it vanished instantly, leaving the creek looking perfectly ordinary. This was no natural phenomenon. He knew it now for sure. Ethan straightened up and scanned the area carefully. He felt that same sensation from the night before, the feeling of being watched. His eyes darted from tree to tree, searching for movement, but there was nothing. Only the stillness of the forest stared back at him. The birds remained absent, the wind refused to blow, and the entire world seemed to be holding its breath. He could feel the hair on the back of his neck standing up. He gripped Rusty's collar tightly in his hand like a lifeline. Just as he was about to head back toward the main trail, he noticed something else, faint glowing paw prints on the ground. Unlike anything he had seen, they matched Rusty's shape, but they shimmered faintly with a soft bluish hue, as if he had stepped in some otherworldly substance. The prints stretched deeper into the forest, disappearing between two thick trees that leaned toward each other like a natural archway. Ethan stepped closer and saw that beyond the archway, the air itself shimmered slightly, as if heat waves were bending the light. He took a cautious step forward, and the shimmering faded, leaving only an ordinary path. But the paw prints were still there, glowing faintly like a trail meant only for him to follow. He stood there for a moment, unsure if he should continue or go back for help. But who would believe him if he tried to explain glowing paw prints? Strange footprints and symbols burned into the earth. The authorities would dismiss him as a tired man imagining things. And he couldn't just wait, not when Rusty was out there somewhere, possibly in danger, so with a deep breath, he adjusted his backpack, tightened his grip on the leash, and followed the glowing trail. His steps were careful but firm, each one pushing him deeper into a mystery that felt bigger than anything he had ever experienced. The further he went, the colder the air became, and a low humming sound began to echo through the forest again. It wasn't loud, but it vibrated through the ground beneath his boots. The sound reminded him of the flickering blue light he had seen last night, and his heart beat faster with every step. He didn't notice it at first, but the trees around him began to change subtly. The bark turned darker, and strange spiral patterns appeared on their surfaces as if etched by unseen hands. He had entered a part of the forest he had never explored before. As the glowing paw prints led him deeper, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking towards something extraordinary, something that had chosen him. The ordinary man who had simply lost his dog was now standing on the edge of a mystery that reached far beyond his understanding. Somewhere ahead lay the answers, but also something else. Something that watched him from the shadows, waiting for his next move. The unexpected visitors. By the time the sun began to sink behind the distant hills, Ethan had spent the entire day exploring deeper parts of the forest he had never dared to enter before. His clothes were damp from the morning mist, his boots were covered in mud, and his mind was heavy with unanswered questions. He had followed the glowing paw prints for hours until they faded into the shadows of the trees. Leading him nowhere and everywhere at the same time, he returned home exhausted. Holding Rusty's collar in his hand like a fragile piece of hope, as he approached the edge of his property, a strange silence greeted him once again. The same heavy stillness that had filled the forest the previous night. It was as if the air itself was holding back a secret, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. Ethan pushed open the gate and stepped into his backyard, and that was the moment when his breath caught in his throat. In the middle of the yard, near the patch of soft grass where Rusty loved to roll and play, there were two small figures kneeling down with their backs to him. They were playing with something, tossing it back and forth, and Rusty's joyful bark echoed through the evening air. For a moment Ethan froze, unable to believe his eyes. Rusty was there, alive and healthy, his tail wagging wildly as he chased the ball between the two figures. The joy in the dog's movements was so natural, so familiar, that it almost made Ethan forget everything that had happened. But then his eyes focused on the children, and a chill ran down his spine. They weren't human. Their bodies were small and slender, with smooth, silvery skin that caught the fading sunlight and reflected it like liquid metal. Their heads were slightly larger than normal, with delicate features that seemed both childlike and alien. And their eyes, those glowing, luminescent eyes, were the same ones Ethan had seen in his dream, round and bright, filled with a strange mix of innocence and intelligence. They wore no clothes that he could recognize, just thin, skin-like layers that shimmered faintly as they moved. They laughed in a soft, melodic language he couldn't understand, a sound that carried both warmth and mystery. Rusty barked excitedly and turned toward Ethan as if to say, "Look, I found new friends." The alien children noticed Ethan at the same time, and their laughter stopped immediately. They turned toward him slowly, their glowing eyes wide, their bodies tensed, and they took a step back, holding each other's hands tightly. Ethan raised both his hands slowly, palms open, trying to show he meant no harm. His heart pounded in his chest, torn between fear, disbelief, and curiosity. He had read stories about strange encounters, seen movies about visitors from the stars, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of two living, breathing alien children playing with his dog in his backyard. For a few long seconds neither side moved. The only sound was the soft panting of Rusty and the distant chirping of crickets that had returned with the evening. Ethan spoke in a calm voice, telling them he wouldn't hurt them. Even though he knew they probably didn't understand his words, he crouched down slowly, making himself appear smaller, less threatening. His movements were slow and careful, like someone trying to approach a frightened animal. The taller of the two children tilted its head slightly, watching him with unblinking curiosity. The smaller one clung to its companion's arm but didn't run. There was fear in their glowing eyes. But there was something else too, an instinctive understanding that he wasn't a danger. Ethan reached down slowly and picked up Rusty's ball, which lay between them. The alien children watched his hand closely, their bodies tense. He gave the ball a gentle toss toward them. Rusty immediately chased after it and brought it back. Dropping it in front of the smaller alien, the child stared at the ball for a moment, then hesitantly picked it up and tossed it back toward Ethan. It wasn't a perfect throw, but it was enough to make Rusty bark happily and race after it again. A small, cautious smile spread across Ethan's face, and for the first time, the tension in the air softened a little. The alien children exchanged glances, their glowing eyes flickering faintly, and then they let out soft, melodic laughs once again. Ethan slowly sat down on the grass, watching them closely. He noticed small details now. Their hands had 3 long, delicate fingers and a thumb that moved with graceful precision. Their feet left faint glowing impressions on the grass that faded after a few seconds. Like soft blue ripples on water, their movements were smooth and almost weightless, as if gravity touched them differently. They seemed healthy, alert, and curious, not lost or injured. But there was a subtle uneasiness in the way they glanced toward the forest every now and then, as if expecting something or someone to arrive. As the last rays of sunlight faded, the forest beyond Ethan's property grew darker, and a cool wind swept across the yard. The alien children paused their play and turned their gaze toward the trees. Their glowing eyes flickered brighter, and their expressions shifted from joy to quiet fear. Rusty noticed it too and gave a low, uncertain whine. Ethan followed their gaze but saw nothing except darkness between the trunks. Still, he could feel it. The same strange hum he had heard the night Rusty disappeared, faint but growing stronger, as if something was slowly waking up inside the forest. Ethan's instincts told him that this encounter was only the beginning. These children were not here by accident. Their appearance in his backyard was too strange, too deliberate. He looked at them again, at their innocent faces and the way they clung to each other for comfort, and he knew deep down that whatever had brought them here was not over. He didn't understand what they wanted or where they had come from. But one thing was clear. His ordinary life had ended the moment Rusty ran into the woods, and now he was standing at the edge of something extraordinary, something that would demand courage. As the night settled fully over the land, Ethan made a quiet decision in his heart. He would protect these children, at least until he understood what was happening. They were scared, vulnerable, and far from home, just as Rusty had once been when Ethan found him as a puppy on a rainy night years ago. He didn't know why fate had chosen him for this moment, but he wasn't going to turn away. Somewhere in the darkness, something was moving, and he could feel that whatever was coming would change everything. A fragile connection. The night deepened slowly, spreading its quiet darkness across the countryside. The stars appeared one by one above Ethan's home, their faint light reflecting in the alien children's glowing eyes. Ethan sat on the cool grass, unsure of what to do next. His heart was still racing from the shock of seeing Rusty with these mysterious visitors. But now the initial fear had shifted into something more complex. He looked at the 2 alien children sitting a few feet away from him. Their delicate figures outlined by the soft light of the moon, they seemed both frightened and curious, their expressions flickering between childlike wonder and cautious alertness. Rusty lay beside them, his tail occasionally thumping against the ground as if sensing that something important was happening. Ethan spoke softly, even though he knew they couldn't understand his words. He told them his name, pointing to himself and repeating, "Ethan," then pointing to Rusty and saying the dog's name clearly. The taller child tilted its head, listening intently, while the smaller one watched his lips move with wide, glowing eyes. It was strange, but Ethan could feel that they were trying to understand. Their intelligence was clear in the way they observed his every movement. He picked up Rusty's ball again and rolled it toward them slowly. The smaller child caught it with surprising grace, then rolled it back toward him. It was a simple act, but in that quiet moment, something unspoken passed between them. A fragile bridge built through trust and shared innocence. He leaned forward slowly, holding out his hand toward them. The taller child hesitated, glancing at the smaller one as if seeking silent approval. Then, carefully, it reached out its long, delicate fingers and touched Ethan's hand. The skin was smooth and cool, like polished stone, but there was warmth beneath it. A living pulse. Their touch was gentle. Hesitant at first, then firmer, Ethan didn't move, afraid that any sudden action might scare them away. For a brief second, their glowing eyes locked with his, and in that gaze he felt something that words could not describe. A mixture of fear, hope, and silent communication. It was as if they understood that he was not a threat, and he understood that they were lost, far away from their home. Suddenly, the smaller child made a soft humming sound, a series of melodic tones that echoed gently through the night air. The taller one responded with a few notes of its own, and together their voices blended into a quiet harmony that felt almost magical. Rusty lifted his head, ears perked, and then slowly lay back down. As if comforted by the sound, Ethan listened carefully, realizing that this was their way of speaking, not through words, but through layered sounds that carried emotion more than meaning. The melody was calming, but beneath it was a faint sadness. Like a song sung by someone who missed home, Ethan's heart ached, imagining what it must be like for two children from another world to be stranded in a place so strange and unfamiliar. As the connection between them grew, Ethan noticed how the children often looked toward the forest. Their glowing eyes flickered brighter whenever the faint humming sound from the woods grew stronger. It was coming again. That strange vibration that had filled the night Rusty disappeared. It was faint at first, like a distant engine, but slowly it grew louder, pulsing through the ground like a heartbeat. The alien children froze, their melodic hum cut off suddenly. Their small bodies tensed, and they pressed closer together. Glancing nervously toward the tree line, Ethan followed their gaze, his instincts telling him that something, or someone, was approaching. He stood up slowly and walked toward the edge of his yard. Peering into the darkness, the forest looked calm, but he could feel a presence within it, something watching, waiting. The alien children began whispering in their melodic tones, their voices quick and filled with worry. Ethan turned back to them and gestured for them to stay close. His protective instincts had fully awakened now. He didn't know who or what was out there, but he knew these children were scared of it, and that was enough for him to decide that he would not let anything harm them. Ethan guided the children quietly toward his back porch, motioning for them to follow him into the house. The taller child hesitated at the door, as if unfamiliar with the concept of walls and rooms, but after a moment it stepped inside, followed by the smaller one who clutched Rusty's fur for comfort. Ethan closed the door behind them gently, turning off the porch light to keep the house dark. He peeked out the window and saw faint moving lights between the trees. Not like flashlights, but smooth, gliding orbs that illuminated the branches without casting shadows. The sight sent a shiver down his spine. Inside, the children stood close together, their glowing eyes scanning the room with cautious wonder. Ethan knelt down beside them and whispered softly, even though they couldn't understand. His voice carried warmth, reassurance, and something protective. The taller child slowly reached out and touched Rusty's head, and the dog responded by licking its cool hand gently. The smaller one let out a soft, almost musical giggle. Ethan couldn't help but smile, even as fear tightened in his chest. He realized that in less than a day, these two strangers had already become something more to him than a mystery. They were now his responsibility. The humming outside grew louder for a brief moment, then suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was sharp and unnerving. Like the pause before a storm breaks, Ethan stared out the window one last time, then drew the curtains shut. He turned back to the children, who were now sitting on the floor beside Rusty, their glowing eyes flickering like tiny lanterns in the dark room. Something about their presence, despite the fear and confusion, filled the house with a quiet, otherworldly calm. For the first time since Rusty disappeared, Ethan felt that he wasn't just searching anymore. He was now part of something far bigger, something that had chosen him. As the clock ticked past midnight, Ethan sat down beside the children, his mind racing with questions he couldn't yet ask. He didn't know who these children were, where they had come from, or why the strange lights in the forest were searching for them. All he knew was that their trust in him was fragile, like a thin thread that could break at any moment, and it was up to him to keep it strong. In that quiet room surrounded by mysteries and fear, a fragile connection had formed, one that would soon be tested in ways Ethan couldn't yet imagine. The forest awakens. The night grew colder as the hours passed, and a heavy stillness settled over Ethan's small house. The faint ticking of the wall clock was the only sound inside, but outside, the forest was beginning to stir in ways that no human ear could fully understand. Ethan sat by the window in the dim light, his eyes scanning the dark tree line. His heart was uneasy, and a quiet tension filled the room. The alien children sat together on the floor near Rusty, their glowing eyes dimmer now. As if reflecting their fear, every so often, they would exchange soft melodic whispers. Their voices trembling slightly, Rusty stayed close to them, resting his head on their laps like a guardian sensing danger. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the forest. He knew something was out there. He had seen the faint lights moving between the trees earlier, gliding in smooth, unnatural patterns. Now, as the wind picked up, the faint humming returned, not just faintly in the distance, but vibrating through the ground like a living heartbeat. It was steady at first, like a low engine, but then it began to build, growing louder and deeper, sending shivers through the air. The trees swayed even though the wind was weak, as if something powerful was moving beneath their roots. Ethan's fingers tightened around the curtain as he stared into the darkness. The humming wasn't random. It had a rhythm to it, almost like signals. Repeating in patterns, inside the house the alien children reacted immediately. Their heads turned sharply toward the forest, their glowing eyes wide with fear. They began speaking in hurried melodic tones, their hands moving in quick, expressive gestures. The smaller child clutched Rusty tightly, burying its face against his fur, while the taller one stood and pressed its delicate hand against the wall, as if it could feel the vibrations through the structure itself. Ethan didn't understand their language, but their fear was unmistakable. Something, or someone, was coming for them, and it was getting closer. Ethan moved away from the window and checked the back door, making sure it was locked. His mind raced, trying to think logically, but nothing about this situation was logical. He was an ordinary man who had woken up that morning to find his dog missing, and now, by nightfall, he was protecting 2 alien children from an unseen presence in the woods. He didn't have weapons. He didn't have answers. All he had was his courage and his will to protect. He turned to the children and spoke softly, telling them to stay calm. Even though his own voice betrayed a hint of worry, the taller child watched him closely, its glowing eyes reflecting trust and fear mixed together. The humming outside grew louder, now accompanied by a strange, shimmering light that began to creep between the trees. It wasn't like a flashlight or any human light Ethan had ever seen. It moved like a fog, glowing softly, wrapping around the tree trunks like liquid. The light grew brighter with each pulse of the humming, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor, and then Ethan saw them. Tall, slender figures stepping out from between the trees. Their bodies were partially covered in dark, smooth armor that reflected the glowing light around them. Their movements were graceful but deliberate. Like hunters following a scent, in their hands were long, staff-like devices that emitted faint blue glows at the tips. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he counted at least 4 figures slowly spreading out near the edge of his property. Their heads moved in smooth motions, scanning the area. The humming grew louder whenever one of them tapped their staff against the ground, sending vibrations through the soil. The alien children gasped softly and backed away from the walls, their glowing eyes flickering wildly. Ethan realized these newcomers were not friendly. Their movements weren't cautious or curious. They were methodical, like a search party that knew exactly what it was looking for. He needed to act. He couldn't let them find the children so easily. He turned toward the 2 small figures, gestured for them to follow him quietly, and led them toward the back of the house. Rusty followed closely, his tail low and his ears alert. Ethan opened the door to his storm shelter, a small underground storage space built behind the barn, hidden beneath layers of wooden boards and leaves. It wasn't much, but it was dark, quiet, and difficult to spot from a distance. He ushered the children inside, whispering for them to stay silent. The taller child hesitated for a second, then nodded slowly and helped the smaller one climb down. Rusty followed them in without hesitation, his loyalty unshaken. Ethan covered the entrance with the boards again and scattered leaves to make it look untouched. Then he crouched low behind the barn, peeking through the gaps in the wood to observe the glowing figures. The humming was so strong now that he could feel it in his chest. One of the armored figures approached the house slowly. Scanning the walls with its glowing staff, another moved toward the porch, while the others circled the property like predators. Their glowing eyes, or whatever sensors they had, moved with precision. Leaving no corner unchecked, Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He picked up a small stone from the ground and threw it far into the forest on the opposite side of the house. The stone landed with a sharp crack, instantly drawing the attention of two searchers. They turned their heads in perfect unison and moved toward the sound. Their glowing staffs hummed louder as they walked. Ethan exhaled slowly, knowing he had only bought himself a little time. But sometimes, a few seconds could make the difference between safety and disaster. He remained hidden as the figures continued their search. One of them paused near the barn. Scanning the ground slowly, Ethan held his breath, every muscle in his body tense. The searcher tapped its staff on the ground, and for a terrifying moment, the humming grew so intense that Ethan thought the boards covering the shelter would rattle. But then, just as suddenly, the figure turned and moved away, following the others toward the tree line again. The shimmering light began to fade slowly. Retreating back into the forest like a tide pulling away from the shore, the humming grew distant, then faded completely, leaving behind the deep silence of the night. Ethan stayed crouched for a few minutes longer. Making sure they were truly gone, his heart was still pounding, and his hands were slightly shaking. He had never experienced anything like this, and yet somehow he had managed to keep the children hidden. He walked back to the shelter and lifted the boards carefully. The alien children and Rusty stared up at him with wide eyes. The taller child let out a soft, melodic sound. Half relief, half gratitude, Ethan climbed down and sat beside them, his mind spinning with questions he couldn't answer. Above them, the forest returned to its quiet, but Ethan knew it wasn't over. Those figures would come back. They were searching for something, or someone, and they would not stop until they found it. The fragile safety of his home had been shattered, and now the real battle was only beginning. The stand. The air remained unnervingly still after the glowing figures retreated back into the forest. But Ethan knew deep inside that their disappearance was only temporary. It wasn't the kind of retreat that meant safety. It was the kind of pause that hunters take before returning with sharper intent. He stood near the shelter entrance, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on his shoulders. The alien children sat quietly in the shadows below, their glowing eyes watching him with silent trust. Rusty lay beside them, alert but calm, his ears twitching at the faintest sound. Ethan understood then that there was no going back to normal after this. He couldn't simply wait for morning and pretend nothing had happened. He had stepped into something far greater than his quiet life, and whether he liked it or not, he was part of it now. He climbed down into the shelter and closed the boards carefully above his head. Sealing them in darkness, the small lantern he kept in the corner cast a warm, flickering light on their faces. The taller alien child stared at the lantern flame with wide, curious eyes, reaching out to touch it. Ethan gently pulled the lantern back, shaking his head with a smile, trying to calm their fear with a soft tone. He knew they didn't understand his language, but they understood his emotions, and that was enough. The smaller child leaned against Rusty's fur, its glowing eyes reflecting exhaustion more than fear now. They had been running for a long time before they found their way to his backyard, and the weight of that journey showed in their quiet. Trembling breaths, Ethan sat down on the dirt floor. Leaning his back against the cold wall, he thought about the searchers, their precision. their technology, their hunting patterns. These were not random wanderers. They were organized, and they had a purpose. He replayed their movements in his mind, the way the humming grew stronger when they tapped the staffs on the ground, the way their formation widened like a net closing in on prey. They were looking for the children, and they would be back, probably with more numbers and better equipment. If he wanted to keep the children safe, he couldn't just hide again. Eventually, they would find the shelter. He needed a plan. His eyes scanned the shelter for anything useful. There wasn't much. Some old tools, a shovel, a hammer, a few wooden boards, an empty fuel canister, and his lantern. He had no advanced weapons, no training, just his determination and the advantage of knowing his property and the forest well. He had spent years exploring these woods, building shortcuts and marking hidden trails for hunting and camping. If the searchers returned, he could use the land itself as his shield. He didn't need to fight them directly. He just needed to mislead them, delay them, and protect the children long enough for another chance to appear. The taller child suddenly stood up and walked to the far end of the shelter. Placing its hand flat on the dirt wall, a faint glow spread from its palm, creating soft ripples of light on the surface. Ethan watched in awe as the glowing patterns formed something that looked like a map. He couldn't fully understand it, but it showed two large circles and several lines branching out like veins. The taller child pointed at one circle, then at itself and the smaller one, then traced a line toward the second circle and looked up at Ethan with pleading eyes. It was clear. They were lost, and they were trying to find their way back to something. Maybe their people, maybe a ship, whatever it was. They needed his help. Ethan knelt beside the glowing map and nodded slowly. He didn't know how he would do it, but he made a silent promise in that moment. He would stand with them, no matter how strange this path became. He placed his hand on his chest and then pointed toward the forest. Indicating that he understood and would help, the taller child tilted its head, then let out a soft melodic tone that sounded like gratitude. The smaller child's glowing eyes softened as it hugged Rusty tightly. For a brief moment amidst all the danger, a quiet bond of trust deepened further, but the silence didn't last long. A low hum returned, faint at first, then growing louder. It was different this time, more intense, like multiple frequencies overlapping. Ethan extinguished the lantern immediately. Plunging the shelter into near darkness, he climbed up slowly, lifting the boards just enough to peek outside. What he saw made his heart race. The forest edge was alive with moving lights, far more than before. At least a dozen glowing figures were spreading out in coordinated lines. Their staffs pulsed with blue energy, and the rhythmic tapping on the ground created a resonating hum that seemed to shake the earth. They were back, and this time they had come in force. Ethan lowered the boards slowly and took a deep breath. He knew hiding wouldn't work anymore. If they searched as thoroughly as before, but with this many, the shelter would be discovered. He had two choices: wait and hope they wouldn't find him, or take control of the situation and lead them away. The second option was dangerous, but it was the only one that gave the children a chance. His mind moved quickly. He remembered the old dry creek bed behind the property that led deep into the woods. It was narrow, hidden under fallen branches, and perfect for confusing anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. If he could lure the searchers toward the opposite side and then circle back through the creek, he could buy the children time. He whispered softly to the children, pointing toward the map they had made and then toward himself. He mimed sneaking out and gestured for them to stay quiet. The taller child watched him with serious eyes, then nodded slowly. Ethan gave Rusty a gentle pat on the head, and the loyal dog stayed beside the children, silent and focused. Ethan climbed out of the shelter into the cold night air. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound sharper than before. He grabbed his old lantern and fuel canister, knowing he might need distractions, and began moving toward the opposite edge of his land. Crouching low, blending with the darkness, the humming grew louder behind him as the searchers advanced toward the house. Unaware that their target had already slipped into the shadows, Ethan moved like a hunter now, using the darkness as his ally. Each step took him deeper into the cold forest, toward the place where he planned to make his stand. He didn't have advanced weapons or alien tools, but he had courage, knowledge of the terrain, and the will to protect the innocent. Tonight, he wasn't just a man who had lost his dog. He was the only barrier standing between two lost alien children and the forces that were hunting them, and he intended to stand his ground no matter what. A new dawn and a silent goodbye. The forest was wrapped in a heavy silence broken only by the rhythmic hum of the approaching searchers. Ethan moved quickly and quietly through the shadows, his every step measured with precision. He had chosen his ground well. The old dry creek bed curved around the edge of his land like a hidden pathway. Its walls made of soft earth and thick roots. He slipped inside, letting the forest swallow him, and moved toward the far end where the creek widened into a small clearing surrounded by fallen logs and uneven terrain. This place was his trap, not because it had weapons, but because he knew every inch of it, every root, every dip in the ground. He could use the terrain to confuse them, draw their attention away, and give the children the chance they needed. He took a deep breath and glanced back toward the faint glow of the house through the trees. The humming had grown louder, echoing like a swarm of distant machines. Dozens of blue lights moved between the trees like a living net closing in. The searchers were spreading out, their staffs glowing brighter, tapping in patterns that made the ground vibrate beneath his boots. Ethan knew that if he made one mistake, they would find him in seconds. He pulled out the lantern and fuel canister he had brought, setting them on a rock in the center of the clearing. His plan wasn't complicated. It didn't need to be. He just needed noise, light, and distraction, enough to make them believe they had found what they were looking for. He crouched low and began unscrewing the fuel cap, the faint smell of gasoline filling the air. He poured a thin line of fuel across the rocks, then set the lantern in the middle. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his old lighter. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of what he was about to do. He was no soldier, no trained fighter, just a man trying to protect two innocent lives that fate had placed in his path. He flicked the lighter once, twice, and on the third try a flame appeared. He held it over the fuel and whispered softly to himself, "For them," then dropped it instantly. The clearing erupted in a burst of orange and yellow flames. The fire spread along the thin line of fuel, crackling loudly and throwing wild shadows across the trees. The humming paused for a fraction of a second as the searchers noticed the sudden blaze. Then it intensified as multiple glowing figures shifted direction toward the fire. Their formation tightened as they moved swiftly, blue light cutting through the forest like blades. Ethan stayed low, circling around the far side of the creek bed. Using the smoke and flames as cover, he could see their tall armored shapes now, moving like shadows wrapped in light. Their staffs hummed louder as they scanned the fire with precise movements. One of them stepped forward and tapped its staff against the ground, sending a wave of energy through the soil. The firelight reflected off their smooth armor, making them look both alien and terrifying. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he slipped through the narrow trail behind them. His plan was working. All their attention was on the clearing, and none of them noticed the lone human moving through the darkness like a shadow. He moved as quickly as he could without making a sound. His boots finding familiar ground in the night, he circled back toward his property, his lungs burning with the cold air and adrenaline. The humming behind him grew louder and angrier. The searchers had realized something wasn't quite right, but it was too late. They were distracted, and Ethan was already far from the trap. Back at the shelter, the alien children waited silently in the darkness, their glowing eyes focused on the wooden boards above them. Rusty sat beside them, ears perked, ready to move the moment Ethan returned. When he finally lifted the boards, their eyes widened with relief. He climbed down quickly and gestured for them to follow him. There was no time to waste. The distraction wouldn't hold forever. The taller child placed its glowing hand against the dirt wall again, lighting up the map it had created earlier. It pointed at the second circle and then toward the forest with urgency. Ethan nodded, understanding immediately. They had to move now before the searchers regrouped. He led them out through the back of the property, down a narrow trail that cut between the trees. The alien children followed closely, their steps silent and light. Rusty trotted ahead, his senses sharp, guiding them through the dark woods. The sky was beginning to shift from deep black to pale blue. Dawn was approaching. and the first faint light of morning stretched across the horizon, illuminating the mist that hugged the forest floor. The humming behind them faded slowly as the searchers focused on the trap, and for the first time in hours, Ethan felt a fragile sense of hope. They reached a wide clearing at the edge of the forest just as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft orange and pink hues. The clearing was empty at first, but then, without warning, the air shimmered above the trees. A massive, circular craft slowly descended from the sky, silent and majestic. Its surface gleamed like liquid silver, reflecting the colors of the dawn. A beam of soft blue light extended from its underside, touching the ground gently like a hand reaching out. The alien children stopped and stared at it with glowing eyes filled with tears and relief. Their melodic voices rose softly, harmonizing in a tone that sounded like joy. Two tall figures emerged from the beam, their forms similar to the searchers but without the dark armor. Their movements were gentle, their glowing staffs lowered, their eyes met the children's, and something unspoken passed between them. The children ran forward, their small bodies illuminated by the morning light, and were embraced by the taller figures in the beam. Rusty barked joyfully as if sensing the reunion. Ethan stood at a distance, his breath caught in his throat. He had risked everything for two beings he hadn't even known existed a few days ago, and now he was watching them return home. One of the taller figures turned to Ethan and raised its hand slowly in a gesture that was neither alien nor human, but something universal. A silent "thank you." Ethan nodded back. Unable to find words, the beam of light grew brighter, enveloping the children and their guardians. The humming returned, but this time it wasn't threatening. It was soft, like a song of farewell. In a flash of light, the craft rose into the sky, disappearing beyond the clouds, leaving behind only a faint blue glow on the grass. Ethan stood in the clearing with Rusty beside him, watching the sky long after the craft had vanished. The forest was quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was peaceful, like the world had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. He looked down at Rusty and smiled, scratching the dog's head gently. He had lost his dog, and in that search he had found two alien children, faced a hunt in the darkness, stood against impossible odds, and witnessed something extraordinary. As the sun rose fully above the horizon, he turned and walked back toward his home. His heart forever changed by a night that the world would never know, but he would never forget.